Disciple Up number 274, Tales from the Scrypt, Gideon Part 4, The Amazing Shrinking Army. Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. This is Louie, and here we are with another edition of Tales from the Scrypt, and we are continuing our story of Gideon. So if you have not heard Disciple Up number 272 and 273, you need to go back and listen to those first because they lay the groundwork for what you're going to hear today. The story of Gideon continues. I'm taking this from my radio show, Tales from the Scrypt, where I write out a script and read it on the air, we'll pre-record it. For our local radio station, I modified it slightly for this format, and since I'm, Lord willing, in Malawi right now teaching, getting this done ahead of time. And I would love to hear what you think of this short-form podcast. Would you like to hear more of this? Would you maybe like a different podcast called Tales from the Scrypt, or have Disciple Up become Tales from the Scrypt? Well, two ways to let me know. The easiest ways, one is to email me, louie@discipleup.org, and the other is to go to the Facebook page, facebook.com/discipleup, and let me know what you think, good, bad, or otherwise. So let's get into today's story, The Amazing Shrinking Army. Have you ever had a very clear picture in your mind of how things were going to go and then have everything turn out differently? Yes, I'm sure we've all had that experience many times. Well, in today's story, we'll see the very same thing happen to Gideon in a way he neither expected nor wanted, but it's what God gave him. The fleeces were done, and at last, Gideon was satisfied that God was indeed calling him to deliver Israel from the oppression of the Midianites. So he gathers all the men who had rallied to him and moved to a site near the Midian army to prepare for battle. This was a common practice in ancient warfare. Both armies would set up fortified camps on or near the field of battle so the men wouldn't have to march a long distance and were fresh for battle. As the army of Israel was in process of doing this, God spoke some amazing words to Gideon. "You have too many men with you," he said, "for me to hand Midian over to you." The Lord said, "Israel might brag and say, 'We saved ourselves.' Announce to the troops, 'Whoever is scared or frightened should leave Mount Gilead and go back home.'" Now, we aren't told what Gideon thought about this, but I don't think it takes a detective to figure out this wasn't what Gideon wanted to hear. He may have thought, "We're already outnumbered, and now you want to make the army smaller, Lord?" Okay. So he invited anyone who was scared to leave, and 22,000 men promptly took him up on his offer and went back home. Now, Gideon had just 10,000 men left. And I'll bet Gideon thought, surely this will satisfy the Lord, but God interrupted and dropped another bombshell on the already shell-shocked Gideon. The Lord said, "There are still too many men. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. If I say to you, 'This one will go with you,' he must go with you. And if I say to you, 'This one won't go with you,' he must not go." So Gideon obeyed and took the men down to the water. And the Lord said to him, "Separate those who lap water with their tongues like dogs from those who kneel down to drink." Now, this certainly seems like a very odd criteria to determine who would fight in a battle and who would not, doesn't it? Some have suggested God is about to keep those who are being vigilant and ready to fight if need be. Those who knelt down and stuck their faces in the water like dogs couldn't see anything and would have been easy to surprise by the enemy. Well, maybe, or maybe not. We aren't told, but we do know why God was doing this, to make sure no one could claim the credit for the victory to come. Everyone would have to acknowledge that this was God's work and God's alone. So Gideon sent all the kneelers back home and was left with a paltry 300 men. In today's military terms, that's just 2 companies or one very small battalion. It was nothing when compared with the enemy's army. The book of Judges doesn't tell us how large the Confederated army that stood against Israel was, but it does say this: Midian, Amalek, and all of Kedem were spread out in the valley like a swarm of locusts. There were so many camels they could not be counted. They were as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore. Translation: they had a whole heck of a lot of guys. Now, if you read much history, you probably know it's in vogue right now for historians to say that the size of ancient armies were almost certainly much smaller than what we read in the ancient record. This is not limited to the Bible, but certainly includes it. So when it comes to Scripture, do we trust this book that is constantly being upheld by archaeology, or doubt it because someone who wasn't there says it's wrong? Personally, I'm going to trust the Bible because so far it hasn't been proven wrong. So Gideon encamps his men on the high ground overlooking the hordes arrayed against him and waited on the Lord. He didn't have long to wait because that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Attack! Go into the camp. I will hand it over to you. But if you're afraid to go, take your servant Purah to the camp with you. Listen to what the people are saying. After that, you will have the courage to go into camp and attack." So Gideon and his servant Purah went to the edge of the camp. We again see the grace of God in Gideon's story, as God knows of his fear, and who wouldn't be afraid, facing thousands of men with only 300, and makes provision for it. So Gideon and his servant carefully sneak down towards the enemy camp, crawling in close to listen to the conversations. When Gideon finally found a good hiding spot near one of the camps, he overheard a man telling his friend about a dream that he had had. The man said, "I had a strange dream. There was a loaf of barley bread rolling around in the camp of Midian. When it got to the command post, the loaf of bread hit that tent so hard that the tent collapsed, turned upside down, and fell flat." Pretty weird, huh? What do you think it means? And his friend replied, "That can only be the sword of Gideon, son of Joash from Israel. God is going to hand Midian and the whole camp over to him." Now, you might be wondering how on earth this guy interpreted that dream to be about Gideon and Israel. It doesn't seem to have much to do with them aside from the loaf of bread rolling into the camp, which could refer to the Israelites camped on the hill above them. We have to remember, first of all, that the Midianites knew about the gathering of Israel and certainly knew about Gideon's camp on the hill. It's not surprising they'd know Gideon's name either, as in ancient days you spread that kind of information around to boast of your commander's skill. You didn't keep it a secret. Notice that it's not just any old loaf of bread in the dream either. It's barley bread. Barley was usually the food of the poor and was often fed to animals, but wheat bread was obviously preferred. However, due to widespread destruction of Israel's crops by the invaders, multitudes must have been reduced to eating barley bread, for they had nothing else. Thus, the load that knocks down the commander's tent was a clear symbol of Israel to them, even if it's not so obvious to us. So now Gideon has his final piece of reassurance. God has patiently built up his faith at every step, while challenging it at the same time. He signed his signs of the fleece, his culling of the army down to almost nothing, and now he is sending dreams into the minds of the enemy. Finally, at the proverbial 11th hour, Gideon is ready to go. Gideon Part 5, Asymmetrical Warfare. Now at last, Gideon was just about ready to go to war. God had answered his prayers and showed him that despite how everything looked, Israel would be victorious. He had gotten the message that this victory would be the Lord's and the Lord's alone. Just one more thing to do, and then it was off to war in a little story I like to call Asymmetrical Warfare. So after an angelic appearance, 2 fleece miracles, and overhearing your enemy confess their fears of Israel, what else did Gideon need to do before obeying the Lord and striking his foe? Worship. Gideon worshipped right where he was, hiding just outside the Midian camp. Quietly, he gave thanks to God, worshipped him as God alone, and committed himself fully to Yahweh and his service. This act continues a major theme of this story, that our lives and our battles need to be God and Christ-centered. Then Gideon snuck back up to his hilltop camp and gathered his men together. If you thought this story had been strange so far, you haven't seen anything yet. Because Gideon divided the 300 men into 3 companies. He gave them each ram's horns and jars with torches inside. And then he told them, "Watch me and do exactly what I do. When I come to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and those with me blow our ram's horns, then the rest of you around the camp do the same and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" Gideon gives his men about as radical a battle plan as can be imagined. To attack at night was dangerous and not done that often. To divide your forces in the face of the enemy was even more dangerous, a violation of the military rule of concentration of forces. But then, on top of that, to give them torches, horns, and jars, what on earth was going on here? What Gideon was doing was as much psychological as anything else. What he does here is what we'd call today asymmetrical warfare, or for those of you a bit older, the term guerrilla warfare might sound more familiar. Since he can't attack the enemy straight on, given his tiny army, Gideon takes the indirect approach and plays up their natural fear of the dark and their mutual distrust of each other. By having 3 groups at different points around the camps, it will look like there's a huge army out there. The enemy will think they've already been surrounded, and nothing strikes fear into a soldier's heart like being surrounded. On top of that, they might wonder, where did this army come from? Could it be those other unreliable tribes are attacking them in the night? What's going on? All of this is designed to panic them and push them off balance. So what happened? Well, Gideon and his group of 100 men came to the edge of the camp. It was the beginning of the midnight watch, just at the change of the guards when the enemy was tired and vulnerable. They blew their ram's horns and smashed the jars they were holding in their hands. The 3 companies also blew their ram's horns and broke their jars. They held the torches in their left hands and the ram's horn in their right hand so they could blow them. And they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Each man kept his position around the camp. Every man in the Midianite camp began to panic. What was happening here? They could see lights around the camp. They could hear the blowing of the trumpets. Why, there must be thousands of men around them. It was dark, and they were sleepy and saw figures moving in the night. It must be the enemy, so they slashed at the moving figures with their swords, only to discover too late that it was in fact their own men. Now fighting broke out amongst them as their panic built, and in only a few minutes they started to break and run, many screaming in fear and panic as they fled. This fear spread like a wildfire into the camps of the other tribes as well, who also heard the horns and saw the lights. They watched their so-called allies screaming into the night and began to panic themselves. Somehow the Israelites had assembled a huge army and were attacking. Their allies were breaking, and they would be next. Again, panic spread, and those camps began to break apart too, as the once confident men ran shouting at their friends to flee as they fled into the night. The 300 men kept on blowing their ram's horns, and the Lord caused the whole camp of Gideon to fight, or of Midian to fight amongst themselves. Now the tribes, who were supposed to be allied but really didn't trust each other, turned on each other completely, and the fighting spread. Just picture this. You have men screaming and running away, other men fighting. All the while, no one has any real idea what's happening. In less than an hour, this huge army was gone, replaced by demoralized and broken men running for their lives. They fled as far as Beth Shittah towards Zerah, and as far as the bank of the stream at Abel Melol near Tabath. Since we aren't certain where all these places were, we can't say for sure just how far the Israelites pursued their foes, but it must have been quite a distance. It was so far that Gideon sends out word that others should help him. Gideon's message was, "Go into battle against Midian. Capture the watering holes as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan River." All the men of Ephraim were also summoned to help. They captured the watering holes as far as Beth Barah on the Jordan River. They also captured Oreb and Zeb, 2 Midianite commanders. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb and kept on pursuing the Midians. Then they brought the severed heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan River. In ancient battles, the majority of casualties usually happened once an army had broken. Then, being pursued, they were easy prey and died singularly or in small groups. You can imagine a long line of corpses, alone or in small clumps, strung out for miles across valleys, hills, and streams, as the Israelites savagely punished their enemies. Gideon drove his men hard, and they pressed on to the Jordan River to finish things up. Along the way, they had to deal with internal political issues, such as the men of Ephraim were upset that they didn't get into very much of the fight, while the town of Succoth refused to give his men any food or water. Gideon successfully dealt with both and pressed on to defeat the final part of the enemy army. In the end, there were around 135,000 enemy dead or captured. Very few escaped, and with the power of the invaders broken, Israel was free once more. Next week, we'll wrap up the story of Gideon with a look at how he dealt with all his successes and the fame that went with it. And I hope that you'll be back with me then, right here on Tales from the Scrypt, the Disciple Up version of Tales from the Scrypt. I'd also really like you to take a moment and get in touch with me either on the Facebook page, facebook.com/discipleup, or email me, Louie, Louie, @discipleup.org. Let me know what you think of this short-form podcasting. Would you like to hear more? Would you like a new podcast called Tales from the Scrypt? Or maybe change this one to Tales from the Scrypt? Or maybe do something else? Let me know. I need to hear from you. I want to hear from you, so please get a hold of me. And until next time, remember that every time is a good time to disciple up. Take care. God bless you. And so long.